Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at North Kentucky University. My guest today is Ran Levi, author of Battle of Minds, The History of Computer Malware, and host of the Malicious Life podcast, which explores the people and the stories behind the cybersecurity industry and its evolution. Ran Levi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me.
You know, we've talked in the past on the Politics Guys about cybersecurity and about hacking, mainly, though, in terms of that very well-known attack on the DNC's computer system during the 2016 presidential election. Now, at the time, my co-host, Jay, suggested that the fault was really, in large part, the DNC's for having an insecure system, and that the Republicans probably weren't penetrated the same amount because their security was better. And as you're an expert in this area, I was hoping you could talk about, well, first off, exactly what happened to the Democratic and Republican committees, who did it, and, really the extent to which poor security might have been to blame for this.
The DNC's hack was a very high-profile hack. Of course, not being a part of the investigation, I can't really say what exactly happened, and I don't think they've released the exact details of the hack. But what we do know, and I did an episode on that in Malicious Life, is that two Russian cyber groups were responsible for the hacks. One was called Cozy Bear, the other one is Fancy Bear. These are names that were given to the groups by Western companies. I'm guessing that the Russians called these groups something different.
Yeah.
Although great names, Bear, Cozy, Fancy,
yeah,
sounds good. But what we do know is that two things. First, these two groups are what we call pseudo-military or pseudo-intelligence. I mean, they are probably staffed by civilian hackers, and are in a way supported or directed by Russian intelligence and military personnel. So there's a kind of plausible deniability there by the Russian government, and that's on purpose, of course. And you'd be maybe the listeners would be a bit surprised to discover that these two groups, separate groups, were probably unaware of each other hacking the DNC systems. It's like two thieves, breaking into the same house, not being aware one of the other. That's because the way that the Russian cyber policy goes, they kind of try to separate different branches of the military intelligence, trying to encourage different groups to one-up one another. So these two groups have different methods of operation, and Cozy Bear, the first one, is the more sophisticated one. We can guess that what they probably did was send some official in the DNC a kind of a booby-trapped email with perhaps a PDF document attached or a doc document, which had some malicious software embedded in it. It's a very common way of attack. And once that email gets open and the PDF or whatever gets open, there's some sort of malicious software running behind the scene. Probably the user wasn't even aware of something happening out of the ordinary on his computer. And then from there, it's just a matter of hopping from one computer to another in the network, slowly getting around the network, learning how the network is, how it is composed, and what are the different systems in it. The second group, Fancy Bear, is usually its method of operations are a bit simpler. Usually, we see with that group using email phishing. In the sense of trying to direct the user to a kind of a URL, to some sort of a URL which kind of seems as if it's legitimate. For example, it could be, I don't know, whitehouse.com, right? Except that the O in house is actually spelled with zero. Just this is a simple example. And if you're not too careful and not not checking each letter and each character, you might not even notice it, except that it's a different website and it's booby trapped. And once your browser gets to that website, it gets compromised, and from there, same process of taking over the network, one computer after the other. So we can assume that that's what happened to the DNC. It's not a very sophisticated attack. And if you say that your co-host Jay suggested that it's the fault of the DNC as well, he's partly correct, because of course for the Russians to penetrate the system, someone had to make a mistake. Someone had to click a document or a link they shouldn't have. But it's not true that the Republicans, just for an example, are in some way immune to these kinds of mistakes. In fact, and I talked about it in the Malicious Lives episode about it, the Republican systems were hacked before in exactly the same manner. Even back as far back as 2008, John McCain's computers were hacked. Both the Russians and the Chinese were infesting his computer and Colin Powell's computer and Lindsey Graham computer. So you can probably say that safely say that most politicians or important organizations, political organizations in the United States, are in some way compromised. We know that that's a great possibility.
It sounds like that the weakest link here, though, really isn't so much sort of these sophisticated security systems or lack thereof, but rather people who click on things they shouldn't click on.
Exactly. That's the human component in the chain of cybersecurity is usually the weakest link, because you can try and harden your systems with sophisticated software and warning systems, whatnot. Usually, you fall victim to the simplest sort of what we call social engineering attacks, such as directed emails, pretending to be an email from a friend, just for an example. Or, maybe you're looking, I've been in cybersecurity, covering and writing about cybersecurity for 10 to 15 years now. And I myself have almost fallen victim to two instances of phishing emails, generic phishing emails. Just a simple example. One time I had this shipment coming in. I was expecting a shipment from Amazon, just an ordinary shipment. And by chance, I got a generic phishing email pretending to be an official mail from Amazon. And I nearly clicked the link, but in the last minute, something seemed off in the mail. And looking deeper, I discovered that it was phishing. It wasn't directed particularly at me. It's just kind of a generic attack. But everyone can fall. And of course, if someone is targeting specifically you, if you are a high-profile target, as for example, DNC, someone in the DNC, you most probably won't have a great chance.
So it's essentially that these hostile actors, whether they're foreign governments or agents of them, they don't necessarily really have to work all that hard to get into these systems then.
Yeah. There are levels of effort that you have to do, because I'm guessing that even though the DNC was hacked, they do have cybersecurity experts working for them, and people were, educated. Software systems were up to date, so it's not as easy, say, hacking as hacking to some random guy whose maybe Windows version is not up to date. But having said that, it's not an operation that requires multi-million intelligence officers and spies trying to collect information. It's rather simple, and you just need patience and trying again and again and again. Eventually, someone in the DNC would click the wrong link.
So it sounds like it's sort of inherently very difficult to secure a system that has a lot of users like the DNC or the RNC simply because there are so many opportunities to send out something that looks seemingly innocuous to any one of those tens or thousands of users. And if they click on it, boom, it can be potentially game over.
Exactly. Michael, you won't believe how easy it is to penetrate the DNC. But really, I mean, the DNC as an organization with thousands of users, all of whom connect to the internet, is a very easy target when you compare it to, for example, a nuclear power generating facility, right? I mean, you would expect that nuclear power facilities would be much better protected, not connected directly to the internet, a much tougher fortress to conquer. And still, most of the nuclear facilities in the United States were hacked or were attacked numerous times, and we know that many of them were hacked in some ways. So you could you could say that the DNC never stood a chance once the Russians had the
Right.
sights on them.
Now, there are also other stories around the 2016 election about saying that Russians or other, hostile foreign powers hacked into state election records and state systems, and that understandably raised a lot of concerns. I mean, how serious of a threat was that?
Um, I don't know of any conclusive evidence for tampering in the election results per se. I know that there are many, many researchers, security researchers, claiming that electronic voting systems are insecure. That the manufacturers are claiming that they are very secure,
Of course.
but independent, of course, but independent security researchers have found numerous holes, security holes, and weaknesses. So I won't go as far as to say that the Russians have hacked electronic systems, but if you ask my personal opinion, then I would say it's very likely. Very, very likely that they have. I mean, once we know that it's possible, and if we know that it's possible, then Russians already probably figured that out. They have experts of their own there. And we know that the Russian government wanted to manipulate the US elections. That's also a given. 1 + 1 = 2. They probably tried. And if they tried, I would guess that they were successful. How far were they successful? Did they manage to actually influence elections in one or two or many more states? I don't know. Nobody knows right now. But I would say that this is a very, very grave and serious threat to Western
Yeah.
democracies, all of them, not only the US, all
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Elections, democratic elections are the heart and soul of democracy. So manipulating elections is a grave threat. And I would say that moving into electronic voting systems is, in my personal opinion, a very bad move in the current state of cybersecurity.
So one would think that at least there should be paper backups of these various things in case there's a question about this then.
So I would say that elections are too important for democracies, Western democracies, to accept the risk of someone manipulating them. Because if the citizens lose trust in elections, they lose trust in the whole process and the whole idea of democratic elections. So I would probably say that it's much, much safer, at least to have a backup paper system, but probably stay out of electronic voting machines at that specific particular point in time.
Now, assuming it seems to be a safe assumption that the Russians are behind at least some of these attacks. And of course, they have elections, but they're not really free and fair elections. Even for us to say counter hack, even if we felt like that was ethically okay for us to do, are there any sort of cyber countermeasures that the United States or other Western countries can take in terms of counterattacking or fighting back against this?
You're right. It's true. I mean, counterattack of the same nature, trying to manipulate Russian elections, is useless because it's not a free and fair elections. So it doesn't matter really what you're trying to manipulate. The other opponent won't win, right? So it's not really feasible. But you could say that right now we're in a sort of a Cold War against the Russians. Not very much different than what we had in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, right? Back then, it was a war of intelligence, of spies. It was all Secret Service against Secret Service. And it's not very dissimilar to what's going on today in cyber war, in the cyber world. I mean, there are many, many levels of attacks, of escalations that you can go to if you think that the other side is attacking you in some sort. The Americans could maybe attack military installations or military networks, maybe disrupt banking systems, communication systems. It all depends on the level of escalation that the U.S. government is willing to go to in response to the Russian trying to disrupt elections. Now, what's different maybe than what we had in the Cold War in the 70s and 60s is the problem of attribution. Back then, if you caught a spy, you could say rather with a large amount of assurance if he's a Russian or not, if he's a Russian spy or not. Right now, it's very difficult to prove that someone is behind a cyber attack. For example, the DNC hack. We can, I mean, after really investigating the attack, whatever, we can say with certain amount of credibility that the Russians were behind that. Yet, as we've already mentioned, these are quasi civilian groups. So the Russians can have a sort of plausible deniability, which makes it a real challenge for leaderships, I mean, for the U.S. leadership to reach an agreement on escalating the conflict. You have to really point a finger at someone without a definite proof and say, no, that's wrong and you need to stop. But then they're saying, of course, we didn't do anything, right? So it's a real challenge of leadership. It's the U.S. can go to war. They can attack. I mean, we've seen the latest attack in Syria, for example. The Assad regime claims they didn't attack anyone with chemical weapons, whatever. And the American leadership and the French and the British leadership, they said, nope, you did it. You must be punished, even though you said you didn't do that. And they did attack. But it's a matter of how let's say, how I'm looking for the right word here. I mean, you can, as the listeners can probably understand, English is my second language. So I'm trying to find the correct word. It's all a matter of how much backbone the leader have.
Yeah.
How confident he is or she is in trying to push the other side.
Yeah, and I believe, in fact, that we know that the United States has even done things preemptively. I'm thinking about cyber attacks to slow down the advance of Iran's nuclear weapons program, for instance, is one thing that comes to mind. And I'm sure there have been others that I'm not as aware of. So it is something that the U.S. government has done in the past.
Yes, I mean, it's always an option.
Yeah, but it seems to me that and I'm sure there are a lot of countries that do this, but it seems like Russia is the one that gets the most that's most in the news lately. In fact, to the point where Kaspersky Labs, they do the antivirus that a lot of people have used. There are a lot of Americans I know who feel uncomfortable now about using that since it's a Russian company, and so it seems like, is Russia really the ringleader of this in the world? Is that your sense?
Russia is definitely one of the gravest threats in that sense, but it's not the only one, maybe not even the biggest one. China is rather well known for having a large body of cyber intelligence and cyber warfare in the military. And of course they are very, very focused on. It's also well known in the last even 10 years or so, very much focused on business attacking businesses
Right.
and stealing trade secrets, patents, and what's not. So in that sense, the Chinese could be even more of a threat, perhaps. All depends on who's getting hurt by the attack. The Chinese, as far as I'm aware of, have no interest in manipulating the U.S. elections per se, or they didn't have any until recently. But they did major damage to the business sector
Oh
of the
gosh, yeah.
U.S. So yeah.
What about like terrorist groups like ISIS or rogue countries like North Korea? North Korea is certainly in the news a lot. What sort of capability do you think they have to wreak chaos electronically with these kind of attacks?
That's a great question. I don't think we should bundle groups like ISIS with countries such as North Korea,
Hmm.
because the terrorist groups are relatively low on money, and they don't have sophisticated experts as countries have. I mean, when you're running a country, you can kind of pick and choose from the population, the people that you want to encourage and have in your service. ISIS, for example, didn't have that, or they don't. They still do. They don't have that pleasure. They only can get the people that want to join them in their cause. And actually, thinking about it, most of the people who join terrorist groups are not very tech savvy, to say the least, right? I mean, most of them are kind of regular kids, maybe misguided kids who fell victim to delusions and propaganda. You won't find too many top-notch hackers in groups like ISIS. So the greatest cyber threat per se that they can pose is mainly propaganda. They could try to kind of release the kind of sort of dreadful movies, videos that we saw from ISIS, and try to instill fear in people. But I don't consider that a grave threat. Countries such as North Korea are a different kind of story entirely. Uh, for example, the North Koreans have been running a kind of haste, banking haste program for the last, I think it's 5 or 6 years. I also did an episode about that in Malicious Life. They hacked into banks all over the world, from the US to Russia to South America to Arab countries, whatever, stealing billions of dollars. I mean, bank hastes in in ways we didn't see before in the history of the world. And these kinds of operations, in this specific case, it's meant to finance the government. North Korea is under very severe sanctions. So these kinds of operations indicate a kind of sophistication. They have personnel. They have the minds, educated people. They have budgets to spend on top-notch tools for cyber attacks, and these kinds of actors are can be considered a serious threat if they wanna, for example, penetrate a nuclear power facility. They can do that. They have the potential. They have the ability. Now, how grave is a threat from a nation such as North Korea? I would say that it's not a major threat. Not, I mean, we tend to see in mainstream media the kind of scary stories. Watch out, the North Koreans are behind the latest ransomware attack, and they can wreak havoc, etc., etc. In truth, it's probably much more difficult to really destabilize a powerful state, a nation such as the US, through cyber attacks. I mean, you can, as I said, penetrate a power generating facility, but you can penetrate one. You can penetrate 2, maybe. If you have lots of manpower, you can penetrate 3 or 4. There are thousands of such facilities in the States. So it's not feasible to disrupt the normal life of a whole country, unless it's for a very short time, maybe. So I don't think let's say the real life threat from these actors is something that regular citizens should probably lose sleep over.
Well, that's encouraging. You mentioned ransomware. I wanted to ask you about that because it had been in the news recently in the U.S. because the city of Atlanta in Georgia, their city government was the victim of a ransomware attack, and it sort of stopped city government dead in its tracks. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, explain to listeners what that exactly is and what happened and how governments and other organizations can respond to those sort of attacks.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the exact case of Atlanta's ransomware. Okay, I'm half the way across the world from Atlanta. So, and I really wish I would visit Atlanta someday, but ransomware is a very familiar threat now. It has been for the last 2 years. So just for the sake of your listeners, what is a ransomware? Ransomware is, as the name indicates, a software that takes over your computer, locks your files, either encrypts them or makes them go away, disappear completely. And then you, as a user, you're getting a sort of scary glowing red screen saying, pay such and such Bitcoins or whatever crypto coin they use, or else your files will be gone forever and you can't decrypt them. That's the basis of cyber ransomware. It's been around for actually much longer than 2 years, except that up until recently, the problem with ransomware was that it was hard for the crooks to get the money from the victims. Because if you're paying someone, for example, you're transferring money from one bank to another, money is traceable. It leaves a trace. So if you're demanding ransom and you're getting the money, and 5 minutes later the FBI is knocking on your door, exactly. you're not going places as a criminal.
No.
But with Bitcoin rising to fame in the last 2-3 years, things have turned completely. Now there's the possibility of what's called a pseudo-anonymous payment. You can send someone Bitcoins without knowing who they are. There are just a series of numbers in the internet. And so we see the rise of ransomware. It's actually in 2016, I think it accounted for something like 70% of all cyber attacks, which is a huge number.
Yeah.
Just within 2-3 years. So I'm guessing that the city of Atlanta, the city's government was attacked similarly. Someone got an email, probably, with a PDF attached or whatever. It contained malware, ransomware. Once he or she clicked the link, the document, the ransomware started working in the background without the user even noticing something. But the ransomware probably was looking for specific files, for example, Word document, Excel files, media, pictures, whatever, and encrypted all of them. And once it did, it spread around the network, infecting all other computers. And we've seen numerous such attacks in the last 2 years, including, I think the probably most famous one was the WannaCry attack in 2017. I think it was early 2017, which hit, I think, several tens of thousands of organizations all around the world. Huge number of computers. Of all sorts of companies and organizations. There were hospitals who were hit, and there were people from media reports. People died because there was no medical information that there was needed. It was encrypted, and it got to the point that many organizations are kind of gathering Bitcoin, hoarding Bitcoins, just for the time when they will be hacked, they will be ransomed, and then they would pay the ransom as fast as possible just to get the files back. And of course, the basic problem with this response is that you're actually encouraging
Right.
criminals to continue. It's the troll under the bridge. They won't go away and while you're paying. But of course, everybody wants their information back, so we can't really blame them.
Yeah. Now, are there any specific things that you see that governments, at really at any level, either they aren't doing or that they're maybe not doing enough of that make them fairly easy to target?
Um, I don't know specifically about cities, for example. I mean, every organization nowadays should have an IT department which should be capable of handling these kinds of threats. Really, you can't run a city now without an IT department who knows what to do. It's impossible nowadays with all the connections and all the networks guiding, controlling everything in a city. Ransomware is just one particular threat out of possible 10 or 20 threats that city should be able to work against. And in that case, they probably failed with the most basic cause route of action, which is backup. Once you have a backup of all the documents, you don't need to pay the ransom. I'm guessing that, right? I mean, the people in Atlanta's IT department, in Atlanta City IT department, are probably banging their heads against the desks, saying, we should have invested in backup solutions. And they will in the future,
Yeah, right. Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah. So another thing I've heard that's oftentimes a culprit is systems that aren't updated quickly enough. And so is that another big part of it?
It is, and it is a much harder or tougher problem to crack than people seem to think usually, because when you hear that, I mean, some computers or some organization didn't update their computers and they are still running Windows XP, which kind of expired
Yeah.
20 years ago. And you're saying to yourself, well, of course they will be hacked. I mean, these are outdated systems. Why hadn't they updated? But it's not as easy as it seems. I mean, take, for example, hospitals. Many of the computers were hit in hospitals by WannaCry last year were XP computers, Windows XP computers. But hospitals, for example, can update operating systems that easily because they are on those operating systems. They are running medical software, which by itself needs to be updated. And you can't take the risk that you'll update the operating system and the software which administers, I don't know, pain medication to someone would go away and someone would get an overdose. You can't take that risk. So there are many levels of updates that need to be done in order for the entire system to be updated. And we're talking, it's a similar problem in any organization. And it's usually not feasible. Most organizations have to be in a sort of a stable state in terms of software, and only occasionally can they take the time to update stuff and be in the cutting edge of, closing all the vulnerabilities, whatever. So we can safely assume that even in the future, even in organizations which are aware of the problem and they know that they need to update their software and they know exactly what they're doing, they will be hacked due to not being updated, because it's a zero-sum game. If you're constantly trying to be up to date and keep all software on the cutting edge of being updated, you can't really do much useful work sometimes. You're constantly updating. So I don't envy ID departments of large organizations. It's a really, really big challenge for them.
Yeah, and it's not. It seems to me then it's not so much a Windows problem, because Windows as an operating system is inherently worse than, say, Mac or Linux, but just simply that's what most people are on, and so that's what the hackers target more than anything else. Is that about right?
Completely right. completely right. We know that there are vulnerabilities in almost any software system, from Linux to Macs, whatever. It's just a matter of the low-hanging fruit. There are so many Windows machines running that usually for hackers, it's much easier just to create one single version of the malware attacking Windows, and they're already getting 70% of all potential victims. In cases where we saw, for example, web servers are usually running Linux operating system. When hackers wanted to attack web servers, they found the vulnerabilities in Linux without too much difficulties. It's there. It's
So,
inherent in all complex software systems have vulnerabilities. It's almost impossible not to.
well, given then that so much is now connected, the whole Internet of Things and all that, and the greater complexity, and that there's clearly money in this, at least for the ransomware folks, is it sort of like we're fighting a losing battle? I mean, are things just going to keep on getting worse and worse, or are we getting better at responding to this stuff?
It's man. I think it's a question. Anyone who would give an answer, it probably depends much more on that person's personality. If you're pessimistic or an optimistic. My personal opinion is that things are actually getting better. Uh, Take for example autonomous vehicles, or even present day, just cutting edge vehicles. We know that smart cars can be hacked, right? I mean, we've seen in the news and media reports hackers hacking into smart cars, hacking into braking systems, whatever. Uh, but the people who build cars nowadays, the engineers who build cars and design cars nowadays, are not the same people who designed cars 20 years ago. These people now, they grew into the internet, into the environment in which we are living today. They from early youth, they are aware of cyber threats. So it's not something that they can kind of, I mean, maybe older designers and older software engineers could say, I've heard about computer viruses, but I've never seen one, so it's probably not a big threat. And it seems funny, but really in the 80s, for example, there were security experts who considered computer viruses to be kind of an urban legend because they'd never seen one. It was pretty rare. Only when they did see one did they really start believe that there are viruses. And designers nowadays, software engineers, car manufacturers, all designers who create sophisticated systems, I think they grew up in a different world. They are much more aligned with present day threats. So inherently, they will design things to be more secure. Now, of course, hackers are getting sophisticated as well, of course. So it's a kind of an arms race. But I'm taking a cue here from biology, I guess, specifically. If you look like, if you take if you move up scale and you look at the battlefield of cybersecurity, it kind of seems much similar to the way viruses and germs
Right.
work against multicellular organisms such as ourselves. They are constantly trying to penetrate our bodies, constantly trying to make us sick, yet sophisticated creatures have evolved sophisticated defense mechanisms. And occasionally we have plagues, occasionally we'll have a strain of the flu which kind of overwhelms the defense system for a while, but then the system is turned to a sort of equilibrium. And that's the way things have been going for millions of years in evolution. And I think that's probably what we'll see in the future with cybersecurity as well. There will be a kind of co-evolution going on. Both attackers and defenders will get constantly better. We'll always be harassed by viruses, malware, cyber attacks, but at the same time, we'll learn to be more secure both in our personal lives and in organizational sense. and it will be a kind of a nuisance, much like viruses. You can't really fight them off.
So it's not going away, but it sounds like in the end, you're, I guess, maybe what I could call you a realistic optimist in the end.
Yeah, I think that's a great term. Yeah, I'll take that.
All right. Before I let you go, I have one final question for you. Do you have any expert advice for listeners who are, concerned about their own security? I mean, should they be worried about things like ransomware attacks and that sort of thing? And if they should be, what sort of things do you recommend that they do to at least minimize their risk, since the risk can never be zero?
Yes, they should be worried. Definitely, they should be worried. What can we do? Again, taking a cue from biology. What are we doing facing threats of viruses and germs? Daily threats. I mean, the world around us is every centimeter of surface is covered with millions upon millions of viruses and germs. We're still alive, right? We're still working. We're not staying at home, sterilizing ourselves all the time. So we need to take the threat in a more rational way, and first and foremost, learn to what I call digital hygiene. That means teaching our kids the same way we're teaching our kids to wash your hands before you eat. Just a basic hygiene rule, which kind of keeps you safe from 70 to 80% of all attacks, all germs and virus attacks, right? Same way with cybersecurity. We need to teach kids from the get-go, from kindergarten, what they should do in cyberspace, what they shouldn't do, how they should keep their private information, how they should keep their information private, what to share online, what are the telltale signs of phishing emails or whatever the current threat is. And if you grow up in a sort of an educated way and you learn that from a young age, then you'll probably be safe from 80-90% of threats online. You won't click suspicious links. You won't enter suspicious websites, whatever. That's one thing. So listeners listening to us right now, be educated. Try to understand. I mean, that's usually just reading some basic stuff on how to be, more careful browsing the internet and installing software, whatnot. But of course, there's always a chance of being attacked, right? I mean, even when you're talking about plagues and diseases, there's always a chance that you'll be hit. So when it comes to cyber security, I would say the basic rule is backup. First and foremost, everyone who uses a computer should have some sort of a backup solution, because usually most of the stuff that we're working on is not that important most of the time. I mean, we've got software we use, we've got browsers we use, we've got services, but most of them are not. I mean, you can always format your computer and reinstall. That's rather easy. What's more difficult to replace is valuable information such as documents, pictures, videos, whatever. So first and foremost, backup, backup, backup. If you can't back up your information, go pay someone who knows what they're doing to set up a backup plan for you, and consider it kind of an obligatory visit to the doctor once a year, right? I mean, it's a way of life. You need to do a yearly checkup. Do a yearly checkup on your data backup. If you have the really bad luck of being hacked, or maybe your bank being hacked and money stolen, or your identity being stolen some way, then you'll probably be in the sort of an unlucky minority, and then you'd probably need to use professional services. Go to security experts. There are companies who deal with those kinds of threats, and you're going to need probably to cough up some money, somebody to fix these things for you. But if you keep your digital hygiene to a reasonable level, the chance that you'll be really badly hit are rather slim and acceptable, unless you're really, really unlucky.
All right. Well, with that very practical and good advice, we will close. Rand Levy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I hope we did some good to your listeners and helped them find their way in this kind of new world of cybersecurity.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.